Welcome back to Legal Principles of Surveying, Spring 2014, East Central Community College in Decatur, Mississippi. This week we're talking about Chapter 8, Locating Easements and Reversions in Brown's Boundary Control and Legal Principles. I really thank y'all for letting me be out for a little while, having a baby. Baby's doing quite well, and we're very happy. But this kind of has put us behind a little bit on the class, and so what we're going to do the next couple weeks is kind of push on through some of these chapters. We are going to talk about easements in this chapter, and then we're going to talk about riparian and littoral boundaries in the next chapter. So, when we try to define an easement is what English law has defined as an incorporeal hereditament, or non-possessory estate, or only a right to use an entire parcel of land or a portion of the parent parcel for a specific purpose or purposes. This chapter is devoted to defining and understanding the concept of easements, because easements are something that can be misconstrued and complicated, and we're going to talk about why that is and issues that arise with it, and then what we should do as surveyors when it comes to easements. So there are some terms in this chapter that are legal in nature, and you may need a dictionary. I needed one to get some of these, because these are not terms that I use in everyday conversation. And even teaching surveying, these are things that we don't talk about all the time. So it'd be really helpful if you took a dictionary, you took your book, and every time you come across a word that you don't understand what it means, look it up. Incorporeal Hereditament. I have a problem with that word. This term literally means intangible property that could be inherited. So if you have property that's not tangible, something physical, and it can be inherited, this is what we're talking about here. Okay? Easements dictate the use of property but they don't dictate ownership of property. So easements dictate the use but not ownership. In this way, easements are not physical property or estate, but could be inherited. So there is the possibility that they could be inherited and passed down from generation to generation. For example, owners A and B have an easement between their properties, which happens typically between two landowners. You may have an easement for ingress or egress, or an easement where we're just using this to get from one part of property to another, or an easement by prescription, or an easement by several different types of easements. So owners A and B have an easement. A passes away, so A dies, but A's heirs inherit the estate. Well, if it's stated in the terms of the easement, in the way it was written, the easement will remain with the heir of the landowners, okay? So, the important thing to remember here is that terms of an easement must be stated. If we don't state the terms inside the easement, then we're going to have a lot of issues with that easement, and that's where a lot of issues arise. Now, non-possessory means somebody cannot own it. A true easement cannot be owned. It cannot be possessed or owned, because remember, it's intangible. It can be passed on, but it can't be owned. It's also based on being a privilege, a service, or a convenience between the parties, and so not one party can own the easement, nor can one party dictate easement principles unless stated in the agreement. It is essentially an agreement between two or more parties for a gain of some measure, but it's not a profit. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. And agreements cannot be owned. The other concept here is that if it's owned by somebody, it's really going to be more of a license. And your textbook talks about that it's not really an easement if somebody owns it. It's really more of a license. So we want to think about this as a non-possessory, nobody can own this agreement. And then right to use. This is a term that's dictated by the type of easement and by the spirit or intent of the easement. A lot of times when you read court cases and you read issues where surveyors are brought in, intent is a big issue. When we talk about original surveys and some of the errors that we find, the errors are overlooked because the intent of the surveyor was different. The surveyor did not intend, according to what we assume, to cause any ill will or any error, but error was caused anyway. Now, throughout this chapter, we'll discuss how different types of easements are created and used. It's the responsibility of the surveyor, you, to define the extents or the boundaries of an easement. The rest of the easement is usually legal in nature. So, again, we're just looking for boundaries and evidence, looking for things that we can come back to. This responsibility may be conducted by creation of an or retracement of an easement. A lot of times we're called out to create an easement and to write one up and to develop it. But the law dictates that lawyers and courts have the legal issues, and we have just the location issues. Remember that the extent of rights are defined by boundaries. So rights are only as good as far as the boundaries that they are extended to. The role of the surveyor. So what should we do? Well, your textbook says along with the survey problems associated with an easement boundary, locations, and retracements, a surveyor may be requested to assist in the determination of reversionary rights. Now, the role of the surveyor is to locate boundaries. Plain and simple. Boundary locations, whether they're created or retracements, they must be located by the surveyor. However, easements are sometimes poorly recorded and can also cause confusion to both their life or the terms of the agreement. And this happens a lot when easements are created between two individuals and there's no record of the easement. So-and-so said I could use his land to go back and forth. I'm going to use the levee as a point of entry into my property. Well, and we shook on it, and it was 1954. Well, things have changed since then, and somebody bought the property and doesn't want the easement anymore. And the issue becomes, is there anything to back it up? And sometimes they're poorly recorded. We can't help that. A surveyor may be employed to determine the location, use, or to research the history of an easement. We're all about researching and evidence and looking into things, and we may be employed to determine this location, use, or research. That's very, very possible. Because an easement is non-possessory, it's treated very different from real property. Laws are different with easements than they are with real property. You don't have concepts of adverse possession with an easement. You don't have the concept of an estoppel with an easement because it's non-possessory. So it's very different from real property. Now, we locate it and show boundaries of it very similarly, but it's not the same thing. Let's talk about reversionary rights. Now, reversionary rights are those rights that can revert or turn back the vacated easement to the adjacent landowner. So let's say that landowners A and B have an easement to allow B to cross A's land to have highway access to B's property. So he needs to be able to get to the highway from his property, but he doesn't have a way. So instead of, what they're going to do is agree on an easement so he can ingress and egress his property. Well, a new road is created on the other side of B's property, and he no longer uses that easement, so he's found another way out. If there's evidence that B has abandoned the easement, for instance, it's grown up, it's no longer used, nobody's driving on it, then it reverts back to A, and we call that when we locate the evidence, if it's reversionary in the easement. And once again, it's all about the terms and words in the easement. A surveyor may be called on to determine if an easement has been vacated. So we may be called out there and you say, hey, this guy's not been using the easement, or these people have not been doing what the easement says, blah, blah, blah. And it's not for us to make the decision, but rather to locate the encroachment and issues regarding the easement. We don't dictate or enforce law. Remember, we don't give legal advice. We don't do any of that because that's not our role as a surveyor. Essential qualities of true easements. Your book states 6 qualities of true easements, and I really think these are good. We've already talked about a couple of them, but let's read through these. They are incorporeal and may or may not be inherited depending on the type. They are imposed on corporeal property and not against a person. That's really important. They confer no rights to profits from the property. That you cannot have a profit from this. They are imposed for the benefit of corporeal property, normally a second parcel, and they're usually contiguous, and we'll talk about that. And there must be 2 tenements, the dominant, which the right attaches, and the servient, upon which the burden attaches. So the servient property would be the property that has the easement crossing over it. The dominant is the one who uses that. And usually a true easement is non-possessive. Now, remember the terms of an easement dictate its terms. I mean, that's really what is dictated was what's in the easement. But due to poor records, little to no writings, the terms may become what we call ambiguous. Incorporeal means non-tangible or physical. We've already talked about that. Easements are, again, not estate or property. They're used as terms or rights of use of property. Inherited easements can be transferred to the death of the owner. If it's an inheritable easement, if it's incorporeal and inheritable, then the terms of the easement will allow that inheritance, and you can pass it on from family to family. But when developing an easement, it's important to understand that it may cease at the death of one of the landowners, and I think you should really tell that to the client. You should say, look, depending upon the type of easement that you want here, think about the life of the easement and how long you want it to go on. Do you want it to go on forever and perpetually after you die? Do you want your family to be able to make a decision on whether it should continue? What do you want to do? And it should really be discussed when it comes to easements that can be inherited. They're imposed on corporeal property without rights. Now, easements are placed on property, not on people. And that's It seems like an easy, simple term, but this can be confusing because many times easements will call out a person, and it's not against the person, but rather the person's property. Easements do not give or transfer the bundle of rights that landowners have. So an easement's not transferring any rights necessarily. Therefore, easements cannot be interest like leases or license to enter property, but rather it's just use. I need to use it for a particular purpose, and that's not necessarily transferring the bundle of rights. If I was transferring property with a quitclaim or a warranty deed, I would be transferring my ownership, conveying it, and all of my rights that I possess and own to another person. But instead here, we're not conveying rights necessarily, we're conveying use. Now remember how interest, mineral or timber rights can be transferred from one landowner to another party? Well, easements are based on privilege, service, and convenience to adjacent landowners and cannot be based on profit. Now, mineral and timber rights, I can use those to make a profit on the property. And depending upon the way that's written, you might get some, you might not. These easements do not promise or convey any rights. And that's really good to understand because we're not making an agreement between two people, but there's no rights transferred from one person to the other, except for rights of use. Now, imposed for the benefit of another. Easements are created for the benefit or corporeal or for real property. Now, look at my graphic here. This is kind of a simple graphic, but you see Highway 489. You see landowner A and landowner B. Now, landowner B has no access to his land. He can't get from the highway to his land. So a easement is created with A that allows B access to his property. This is ingress and egress. He can go in and out of the property as he pleases, as he wants, and A cannot stop him from going in and out of his property, which means A can't put up a gate. A can't influence whether he uses that or not. The easement benefits B, but it imposes on A. So we're imposing for a benefit of another. Now, some would say, well, as A, I'm not going to give him rights. I'm not going to let him put an easement. There have been many court cases where you don't have a choice. The court decides and says he can't have full use of his property. You're stopping his rights. And this is where a lot of issues come out from easements. Is some people don't want other people on their land, and yet an easement is developed and created regardless of what the other people want. Two tenements. Now, easements are between two landowners, the servient and the dominant. The servient has the imposed easement. So if you look at my graphic here, I've changed names from landowner A and B to servient and dominant. You can see kind of how that would work. Typically, the servient has no right to deny the easement to the dominant, and you can't just say no. Now, there are special cases, and if you look up the cases where it has been done, there are special cases where, yes, easements have been denied based on certain values and rights. But typically, you cannot deny the easement from a servient to a dominant owner. Now, there are 16 principles in Chapter 8. We're not going to go through all of them, but I will list many of them as we come to particular points and qualities about easements. Remember that easements are recorded instruments of writing. They're just like a deed, except they're not dealing with real property. How an easement is defined by the writing carries more legal weight than the general type of easement that it may be. And so remember that not necessarily the wording of the type, but the wording of the writing itself. And your book talks a lot about wording, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But how easements are worded is extremely, extremely important. Easement principle number 1. An easement is an incorporeal non-possessory right or hereditament of a party to use the property of another person for a specific purpose or purposes. Now, the quotes from several court decisions are on page 209. It kind of gives you some of the following terms: special purpose, privilege, service, or convenience without profit, advantage in the lands of another, grant or agreement express or implied. And they kind of give you a more academic definition down there. It talks about a privilege which the owner of one adjacent tenement hath of another, existing in respect of several tenements, by which the owner against whose tenement the privileges exist is obliged to suffer or not to do something, or in order to regard, in regard to his own land for the advantage of him in whose land the privilege exists. So really it comes down to easements are so very different from what we would term as a lease or a license. If I give you license to enter into my property to go fishing, you can profit from fishing. I can't give you an easement to allow you to go fishing. That's not an easement. It's a license because you profit. You gain something from it rather than just use. A lease. I may lease hunting land out. I can't make an easement for you to go hunting on my land. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Because it's a very different body and a very different type of law. Okay? Now, Principle 2. The boundaries of an easement may be described in many ways, and there's no single absolute way to describe an easement. According to your text, any surveyor researching easements will find what we like to call a multitude of descriptions, and that's at the top of page 210. Because easements do not fall under the category of real estate, they may or may not have stated standards of practice on the creation of these boundaries. Now, different states have different laws and different ways of looking at easements, and even different counties and different local municipalities have different ideas on easements. And this can cause great confusion and frustration for the landowners and for the surveyor, because remember, we're supposed to be going back and locating boundaries and retracing things and doing evidence and research. Well, we may not have any evidence and research to find, or the descriptions may have changed so much that the intent of the easement is lost. However, it is still our responsibility as surveyors to locate those boundaries to the best of our ability. Now, there are a lot of instances where I've heard people say, well, one surveyor is better than another. That's not necessarily true. We all see things a little differently, and I think I've talked about with you in this class that not every surveyor is going to do everything exactly the same. And so the concept here is, you may have an easement that was done by one surveyor and you may not think he did it right. Well, he did it to the best of his ability. And so that's what we are always doing, is the best of our abilities. Now, in many instances, according to your textbook, the landowners must resort to a litigation in order to determine such questions as, is an easement present, or is it an easement, or what is the extent of the easement? Now, the surveying problem becomes apparent when there's little evidence of easements in the field or in the courthouse. When there's little evidence to go around, then it's more difficult to really see where the easement's supposed to be, or exactly what the wording of the easement needs to be. If you look in your textbook on page 210 once again, and talking about down in about the fourth or third paragraph there, talking about centerline easements. You know, easements may use terms like 25 feet off each side of the center line, or it may be interpreted as 25 feet or 50 feet. It depends on your way you think. Some people may read that as, well, that's 25 feet total in width. Others may say, well, it's 25 feet off center line, so that's 50 feet. 25 feet off one side, 25 feet off the other. And depending on the wording and the way it's set up, it could be confusing. So you can kind of see where this could come into play. Now, these easements, these are common. They're called centerline easements according to your textbook, but you still may have issues with understanding exactly what the easement is wanting. Principle 3, and in an easement, a grantor can grant only those rights that the landowner has and no more. Now, this returns back to that concept of the bundle of rights. A landowner cannot convey rights that they don't possess. That's just the way it is. Now, the textbook uses an example of a life estate. If you look at the top of page 211, it talks about a life estate. And a life estate's where the person who owns the land conveys all of their interest to another person, usually a family member, but they retain the rights until death. So the landowner that has the life estate, he says, well, all right, grandson, I'm going to let you own the property. Your name's on it, but I still have rights to it until I die. Now, when he dies, all the rights then go to the grantee, to the son or the grandson. Now, this is all good and fine, but in this case, a grantee cannot grant or agree on an easement without the permission of the life estate holder. The life estate holder is still in charge until he dies. So the grantee cannot grant those rights to an easement without the grantor's approval. You can't convey or grant or create an easement over anything you don't have possession over. I can't go to your land and say, all right, yeah, Billy Bob, you can go right across his land, no problem. I can't do that. That is not legal. And it comes back to the whole bundle of rights and common law deals. Now, typically, state law requires for the surveyor to conduct title research on all sorts of easements. The concept is you need to go back as far as you can on the easement. Now, the burden of locating easements will fall on the surveyor, and the depth of research must satisfy local laws. But also the moral and ethical code that all surveyors should hold. I mean, it really should come back to, yeah, I must do exactly what I need to do in order to meet the standards, but also I need to follow the moral and ethical code. If I find where an easement was misused, or if I find where an easement was written poorly but the intent says something different than what it's being used for now, then I need to be able to say something about it, and in my evidence I need to show that, hey, there's a problem. Now, there's no burden on the legality of the easement on the surveyor, because remember, we don't dictate, create, or enforce law, but rather we testify the boundaries in the easement with our surveys and research. Whatever you find in the field, whatever you find in the courthouse, you turn that in as your research and evidence. And generally, we don't have to do anything with the law when it comes to easements, rather than just locate and give evidence to and testify to the courts. Easement principle number 4. Whenever an easement is granted for a specific purpose, the fee title to the land encumbered by the easement remains with the grantors of the easement, their heirs, and assigns. Now, this is a simple concept to apply to easements, but remember, wording is really it's really important. In the event an easement is granted to the grantee, the easement will fall into 2 categories, and there's 2 types of categories where this could change hands to: an appurtenant and a gross. Now, appurtenant, the easement attaches to the land encumbered, the grantor, and transfers whenever the land is sold, conveyed, anything. So if I sell this piece of property and I'm an appurtenant, I have an appurtenant easement, then that's going to transfer when I transfer the property. Now, gross, an easement is considered to be personal and would terminate as soon as the landowner changes, either whether he conveys, souls, or if he is deceased. And a lot of times, gross easements are what's out there. It's between 2 landowners or 3 landowners, and once one of them dies, the easement is no longer void. It's dead, nothing. So that's kind of the concept that they're talking about in Principle 4. Principle 5. I want you to read this one from the textbook because it was so long. Between private parties, there is a presumption that fee simple title is intended to be granted in a deed to real property unless it appears in the writings that a lesser estate was intended. Unless there is a statement to the contrary in the conveyance or the statute otherwise, the presumption is that the public acquires an easement only in highways. Now, the wording of how the easement is created and its purpose is subject to extreme scrutiny when the word easement is omitted from the writing. Now, if you look on page 212, you see where wording is extremely important. That first paragraph at the top of 212 talks about issues with wordy or strange wordings on the easements. For example, an easement that is set aside for road purposes may pass as an easement, just looking at it, but it can only be used for road purposes. So what if I want to use it for something else? Well, I can't. And this is where wording can make or break a good easement or description. You have to think about the intent and the wording behind the intent as we go through these surveys. As surveyors, it's our responsibility to know the law in the state in which we practice. If we're in Mississippi, then it's the Mississippi Code. And this textbook gives a couple of interesting examples of local easement law. You can see them in the last paragraph in section Principle 5 there on 212. You see where it talks about some of the issues in the state of New York and California. But really, it comes back to we need to understand what these words mean in local law, lex loci, and we need to look at law for our state. So if you're going to work with an easement, you need to be looking at the Mississippi Code and talking about easements. All easements have the 3 basic descriptions that may have to be created or retraced. According to the text, these are 3 descriptions that must be investigated: the description and the location of the dominant parcel. And this pertains to the parcel that benefits the most from the easement. Remember, we talked about dominant and servient. The location and description of the servient parcel. This is the parcel where the easement crosses or is contained within. And then description and location of the easement itself. Now, you as a surveyor, when you're working on an easement, you must research all 3 of these things. It's not just one thing, it's all 3. Because all 3 have something to do with the easement. And really, when we get down to it and start reading, all 3 may have something different on them. Principle 7, a surveyor may have to fully understand an easement description, in order to locate and describe a new easement and to relocate existing easements. Now, the field and courthouse research that you do is the only way most easements can be understood. I can't walk outside and look at an easement that's used and understand the terms behind it just by looking at it. That's not possible. New or relocated easements should be done with very, very, very much care. Understanding that the intent and the location for the sake of the dominant and servient landowners is important. if I'm a dominant landowner and I'm going the wrong way, or I'm using the wrong part of the easement or for the wrong purposes, I am then inflicting issues with the rights of the servient. So it's really important that we locate these with care, where we place them with care, thinking about and understanding that this is for the sake of the two landowners here, or three landowners, or however many it may be. It should be noted that courts hold the singular authority to determine the validity of a description in regards to an easement. No one else does. The courts decide. Nobody else. They hold the singular authority. Now, Principle 8. If there's a question of whether an easement is incorporeal hereditament or a fee conveyance, this may be a question of fact and law, but it does not affect the location of the boundaries. That's a surveyor question, and that's true. Easements are a question of fact and law. That's just the way it is. But they have to have boundaries in order to be defined, and you can't have rights of use without an extent defined. We are responsible for the research and location of the boundaries for the easement. Once again, we should never practice law or give legal advice. This is something you'll hear from me all semester long. But we should provide the boundaries in a clear, concise way with the highest level of ethics and accuracy that we develop. The best we can do, we give them the best. But we are not there to do anything with law. That's not our deal. Principle 9. A meets and bounds description with a road as a boundary must be written to positively exclude the road. Otherwise, in those cases where the grantor owns the bed of the road, it will be presumed that the conveyance is intended to convey title to the center of the road, subject only to the public easement. Now, this is a common misconception. A lot of times, a description will call for the center line of the road as a boundary. And the landowners may think they have those rights, but most of the time they don't. I'll give you a pure example. My parents live in Kemper County, and their description says they own to the center of the road. But they don't, because the road that goes through their property is a main thoroughfare, and it has right-of-way, and the county has right-of-way and cuts the grass. So, yeah, they don't own the center line of the road. But in some cases, it has happened and does happen that there is an abandoned road and the landowners truly do own to the center line. In the case of that abandoned road, the description calls for the center line, then the landowner retains the bed of that road. If we're landowners A and B and we're separated by a road and we own to the center line of the road and the road ceases to exist, well, we both get that strip of land, the bed under the bed of the road. But we must remember that the public right-of-way of any road cannot be owned by the landowner. You can't adversely possess, you can't own, you can't use any part of the public right-of-way except for just express use for the property itself. Now, this provides transport of utilities and allows for improvements to the roadway. Now, in order to reduce the amount of confusion, the description of the easement should have language that defines exclusion of the road from the owned parcel. We read that in section 8.8 there, talking about centerline presumption. If this is left undone, then there can be multiple court proceedings in the future of the parcel to determine what the intent of the description writer was. Once again, wording. As surveyors, our responsibility is not only to locate existing easements, but we'll have to write descriptions as well. There will be a case where you need to write a description, and it's really important to note that clarity is a vital part of developing a good description of an easement and a description of any piece of property for that matter. Use language that's clear and investigate the language of prior land conveyances and easements to understand the full scope of the description's intent. I was in a class at Mississippi State, and we had to write a legal description. Well, I'd never written one before, and the ones in the book were just kind of dried, cookie cutter. So I went to the courthouse and got a few descriptions from different pieces of property. You notice very quickly that there is an ebb and flow with descriptions and a way it's written, but you also see that many people do them very differently. And so you want to make sure that you use clear, concise language because that is vital to understanding and future investigating of a retracement and or what the scope of the land is. And your intent needs to be expressed very strongly inside of a description of any kind. Now, some cases and concepts. If you read the case example on page 217 through 219, and I really encourage you to do that, it talks about how a subdivision was created, lots and monuments were set, and there's a question about the easement. If you look on page 218, it gives you figures and examples, and then on page 219 gives you kind of the finalization and what the judge said. Now, note how the data and evidence is compiled. Note how they were going through there. They looked at evidence based on, when was it created? How was it created? Who had who was supposed to be owning things, who had the riparian rights. Easement states what they compiled all that, and note that they were putting those forward. Okay. Then there's a list of problems with that. Notice that the problem is the owner of 15 built his dock on the riparian land, but then they took away they destroyed his dock and created their own in lot 16 and 18. Lot 15 called the police to stop him, but he was put under a restraining order and was told 16 and 18 could build their docks, and 15's had to go. So notice how the problems were arising. This is getting very almost very heated. I mean, imagine if somebody came out there and destroyed part of your property because they thought you didn't have the rights to it. Then finally, questions that must be answered. Now, look at questions 1, 2, and 4. They all have to do with boundaries. Boundaries, boundaries. Interesting. Questions 3 and 5 deal with law and how the law handles situations such as these. And that goes back to case law that's covered by the lawyers and the judges. When you read case conclusion by the judge, notice how the ambiguity of the response causes more problems. At the top of page 219, he talks about that somebody still owns the strip. Well, who? Is it the people who originally, had the land? I mean, who owned it? And he stated that the owners of the easement rights having a water boundary could place docks in the canal, but he said the strip was owned by somebody, but he didn't state who. At the printing of this text, it was still unresolved because there were still people fighting over it, and I don't doubt that this will be fought over for many years. Welcome to the world of easements. Typically, an easement work between two people works well. The more and more and more that we go about here, the more people you add, the more kinds of people you add, the worse it gets. People want to abuse things or misuse things, and it really becomes an issue. And it's something that we should look out for as a surveyor, but we're going to have those problems. So that's a good case. You need to read through that case. Now, skipping to Principle 10, Principle 11, sorry. Skip Principle 10. Unless a deed or a map that is created in an easement or dedication indicates otherwise, reversionary rights extend from the street termini to the property lines to the center line of the thread of the street in the direction that is right angles from the center line of the street. Now, I want you to look at Figure 8.3. Look how the rights are. You see the center line of the road, center line of the street, and you notice that the reversion rights that they're showing there, the little dashed lines, go from a normal from 90 degrees to the ends of the boundary lines for the parcels of property. Now, when an easement is extinguished or ceases to exist, it will pass into reversion, if it's stated in the easement, and will be given back to the landowners that have an interest. Now, this occurs unless the easement has some language preventing the reversion, or some language that states reversion can only happen under certain circumstances. Note how the easement is split from the center line of the easement at right angles to the boundaries of the affected parcels. Now, if there's no clear monumentation, the boundaries of the parcels can become unclear, because remember, monumentation is everything in the field, and in this case, courts may have to interpret what evidence to grant reversionary rights to in the easement. That can be very difficult. If you keep looking, though, if we look at Principle 12, it's a very similar principle. Reversion rights to the lots in the middle of a block extend radially to the center line of the street on a curved street. So if you look at Figure 8.4 on page 222, you see how the reversionary rights come out still perpendicular, but they come based off of a radially extension based off that curve. And so you see the reversion rights, the dashed lines. Now, similar to Principle 11, the reversionary rights extend from a curved easement radially to the adjoining parcel. Again, this can be played because if there's not any monumentation, or the dominant and servient parcels are having a disagreement between each other, you can have all kinds of problems. Now note the graphical examples all the way from 8.5 to 8.11, starting on page 223, all the way through 224, 225, 226, and 227. You'll see where the reversionary rights can be changed based on the shape of the road, based on the math that's done, based on whether there's an indetermination of where the boundary should be. There's an infinite number of situations when dealing with reversions. Now, these examples are here to help you understand many situations that you may face. Now, this textbook is not does not state that it has all the answers, but it's a very good reference when it comes down to reversions, because you can then go back and look at this and say, hey, I think that reversion is going to be reversion angles at the right from right angles of the street. I think we need to go that way instead of doing something different. So use this as a reference. Hang on to this book. It's really, really good. Principle 15, by law and definition. I'm skipping a bunch of principles here, but because they kind of say the same thing over and over. By law and definition, an easement is a non-possessory right to use property of another person. Now, this principle must be understood when retracing or creating easements. Law and definition states an easement is non-possessory, and it's a right to use property but nothing else. Wording may seem to imply something totally different, but that's what an easement is, okay? And once again, wording is what we're basing on, so good descriptions are very important. It's the job of the surveyor to be sufficiently knowledgeable so as to provide the client with help should a situation occur. Now, you can help. You can say, we might want to do this. But once it's already done, you have no legal rights, no legal rights to change anything or say anything about it. Remember that we are responsible for the clarity of the easement description. When you see a bad description, that falls on you. If you wrote a bad description, if you have to retrace a bad description, you've got to do all of it. So there's a lot of burden and responsibility here with easements that we may not otherwise have on some other things. Now, Section 823 kind of gives you a conclusion about easements and kind of gives you a great description of how to use this chapter. There are a lot of easement questions on the fundamentals and the professional surveying exams from what I've seen. When I took the fundamentals, I know there were at least 8 questions on easements, and that's important. You know that situations will come your way when you don't have all the answers. And in that case, be willing to search out for information, consult legal experts. If you know someone that deals with land law, talk to them about situations that you may be facing. Also use this textbook. I mean, it's really a good textbook, and I wouldn't have told you to purchase it for this class unless it were useful for you in the future. Now, as surveyors, we still need to possess working knowledge. Understand that. But particular issues may open us up to a situation that we're unfamiliar with. So don't be afraid or too prideful to ask somebody else for advice or for help. Now remember, state law dictates the principles of easements and courts decide on legal extent. But we as surveyors define the physical extent or the boundaries of the easement. That's really important to remember. Okay? And that's basically the whole theme of this chapter was we still locate everything. I think this whole book could be summed up in surveyors locate stuff. But anyway. Alright, this week we have quiz 6. It's going to be open until I think Monday night at midnight. It's on Chapter 8 slides. These slides is also from questions in your book. Remember, Proctored Exam 2 has been open since March 26th. Today is the 28th of March. It's going to be open till April 4th, 2014. You need to make sure that you schedule a time with your local e-learning department to take the exam. This is proctored. This is not something you can just, hey, Mr. Riles, I'm going to take this. No, you need to sign up to take it. Remember that a semester paper assignment is due on April 22nd by 5 p.m. Remember, and don't wait to the last minute to get started. I'm hoping that all of you have already read the case, have made notes on the case, and have started your paper. If right now you're sitting there going, I'm not there yet, then you're behind. If you don't catch up, you're not going to complete it for the semester. And remember, I want your best effort with this. I'm going to grade it. I'm going to grade it grammatically. I'm going to grade it on a lot of things. But if I see shoddy effort and I see that you really didn't put a whole lot of time into it, then I'm not going to, you're not going to get a good grade for it, because it's all about effort. I thank you guys for listening to me. I hope this helps. We will be covering Chapter 9 next week. We'll be talking about riparian and littoral rights and issues with those boundaries. So just stay tuned for that. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you guys later.